First, I gotta set up my streams. Try not to mute. I'll try not to mute Patreon this time. How do we share it? Share it there. Okay. Okay, live streaming. It's doing that thing where I can't see the video again. Oh, because my camera's turned off. It's always because you didn't plug it in, man. Every single time. Okay. Where's my chapter? That's not what I want. Oh boy. Thought I had everything prepared. Oh, I do. It's in a separate thing. There it is. All right. We're going to try this again. So this is a chapter of Culting of America, which is the book I'm currently actively researching and writing. And it was kind of the birth of these channels was, I wonder if other people want to know all this fascinating, interesting stuff that I'm learning about cults. So I wrote, this chapter is called A Hitler and a Churchill, because I'm basically saying leadership is not good and bad. Those are not scientific things. Leadership is effective and non-effective. Let's talk about charisma. So then we talk about charismatic authority and what it is, which is when we give someone power over us, right? Because of some qualities that they own. And then now we are recording the road to deification. And I stopped so many times to do soliloquies while I was recording it the first time that I'm probably just going to do it all again right now, because it'll be faster. Is that air conditioning sound bad? Just turn that off. Thanks. Okay. Hopefully it doesn't sound too bad. Okay. Excellent. So the road to deification is just what I'm calling the process of like how these cult leaders become essentially people's kind of godlike figures. And the background story is I did this by just reading a book of Jim Jones and knowing enough different cult patterns to be like, oh, so it's this, and this. And then we put it together and put the research in. The road to deification. Jim Jones started as a Christian pastor who grew his Northern California congregation with progressive messages of inclusivity and love. But eventually, the People's Temple became pointedly non-Christian, with a focus on Jones as the ultimate head, their God and Messiah, if you will. And he worked hard to become so. As a young man, Jones spent time actively developing the charismatic traits that would enable him to build and lead a cult later in life. Inspired by his participation in especially charismatic Christian traditions like Pentecostalism, he honed these skills and, boasting the intonation and pastor of a Baptist preacher, the complex theorizings of an Aristotelian philosopher, the folksy wit of a countryside fabler, and the ferocious zeal of a demented tyrant. He became a linguist chameleon who possessed a monster arsenal of shrewd rhetorical strategies, which he wielded to attract and condition followers of all stripes. Once he found his place as a preacher, Jones turned to advocating racial equality, something that, as a white man in the tumultuous 1960s, made him stand out. Being a racially conscious white pastor became his unique value proposition, and many African Americans flocked to his congregation, helping to build a church that was integrated to a level unheard of at the time. Over the next few years, Jones proved himself to be a master of the cult leader's playbook, finding ways to increasingly isolate his followers and build their righteous, persecuted, paranoid, and apocalyptic group identity. As he gained more and more control, Jones eventually renounced religion altogether, claiming that it had always been his plan to use religion to make Marxism appear more palatable. His followers, trained not to question him, didn't blink, and they no longer needed religion because Jim Jones had successfully replaced God in their hearts and minds. When authorities began sniffing around their Northern California compounds, alerted by ex-members and worried families, it only fueled the fire of Jones's persecution complex, and he convinced nearly 1,000 of his followers to emigrate to Guyana, a small country in South America, where they would build their communal equal utopia, free from the oppressive forces of the US government. By the time he'd coaxed them into geographic isolation, where he had complete access to exploit their labor, he'd also turned himself into the venerable Messiah of the People's Temple. Whatever he said would now be taken as divine mandate by his followers, who were, according to journalist Tim Reiterman, decent, hardworking, socially conscious people, some highly educated, who wanted to help their fellow man and serve God, not embrace a self-proclaimed deity on earth. But it was too late, and the process of Jones's deification was complete. He was their Messiah, and they would follow him anywhere, even as far as repeatedly rehearsing the act of revolutionary suicide in preparation for their coming apocalypse. The writer Shiva Naipaul argued that the People's Temple was at heart a fundamentalist religious project obsessed with sin and images of apocalyptic destruction, authoritarian in its innermost impulses, instinctively thinking in terms of the saved and the damned. The result, Naipaul wrote, was neither racial justice nor socialism, but a messianic parody of both. Nearly 1,000 dead in a mass murder-suicide was the ultimate result of one man's deification taken to the extreme. The process of becoming a charismatic leader, which can be understood in its extreme form by studying cult leaders like Jones, includes an element of deification, or how the leader makes themselves appear to be godlike, infallible, all-powerful, and all-knowing, even in presumably the most secular vocations, such as business or war. Kings of old used to rely on the power of deification to confer authority outright, speaking of the divine right of kings, while the pharaohs of ancient Egypt named themselves directly as god rulers. Pick up any modern book on leadership, and you'll likely still find a discussion of the power of myth when it comes to leadership, of holding oneself a bit separate and above while crafting a singular story of the superhero leader who comes in to save the day. And doesn't that sound just a little bit like Weber's concept of charismatic authority, infusing magic back into our workaday lives? There's an aspect of deification that also has to do with being saved, even in secular form. If a religious leader or army general or startup CEO or wellness influencer is riding in on a white horse to save us from hell, or terrorists, or the toxic byproducts and existential. No. Damn it. Sip of water. There's an aspect of deification that also has to do with being saved, even in secular form. If a religious leader or army general or startup CEO or wellness influencer is riding in on a white horse to save us from hell, or terrorists, or the toxic byproducts and existential disappointments of the modern age, we can put our faith in them, ultimately relieving ourselves of both the responsibility of having to take action ourselves and the of uncertainty. In chaotic times, their sure picture of the path forward is a relief, even if moving toward is a kind of apocalypse. At least we know what to expect. Culty leaders thrive on this kind of teleological, the war on terror, until he was relieved of duty for much scrutiny. Too many of us, seduced by the ideology of what good leadership looks like, miss the reality. We intuitively know leadership is critical to success in the modern world, but we don't really understand what that leadership consists of. So we use storytelling to build our myths, who is endowed with special talents and traits not shared by mere mortal men. This sounds an awful lot like the great man theory popularized in the 19th century, which asserts that those in power are entitled to lead because of the traits they've been born with. And that history is nothing more than a collection of biographies of great and powerful men. No modern historian or sociologist worth their salt such a theory seriously these days, and other than real people. In quotes. Now I need to tie my yarn. And I'm going to repeat my rant about General Stanley McChrystal, which is, he wrote a pretty good leadership book, and he takes on the great man theory, and he's like, this is dumb. Leadership is contextual every single time. And then he makes a note at the end of his book about the lack of women and how because of the great man theory, it's hard to find women that history considers to be great leaders. But then when he had a book, he did not choose a woman when there are like a lot of available women captains that he could have chosen instead of the male one he chose. So I feel like this is when white cisgendered men are like, see, I'm doing the diversity thing. I mentioned it. Oh, that sucks. As anyone can tell you, whoever went to one of WeWork's company offsites and was transfixed by Adam Newman's performances, or anyone who was brought to God by when we can't put a finger on why. An important part of this particular magic of charisma is the power of holding oneself as someone a bit separate, creating an element of mysticism and mystery that cannot be explained, and further emphasizing for the followers that the world is full of uncertainty, but the leader alone has the answers. Even the US military swears by their policies forbidding officers to fraternize with the soldiers under their command, because heaven forbid you are seen as a human and they begin to question your orders and authority when things go bang. Because we've ultimately failed to understand why charismatic leadership produces the magic effect that it often does, we tend to focus on the outward traits that we feel make a good leader. Traits like extroversion, personableness, and confidence, causing us to turn a blind eye to the presence of deification as these leaders turn themselves into little mini gods in their own companies, military units or feel incomplete. In stories from this decade, we have cases like that of FTX, Twitter, and Theranos, companies who all seem to have fallen victim to an all too popular belief that superhero leadership trumps boring management. According to Harvard Business Review article, The Myth of the Brilliant Charismatic Leader, General McChrystal tells us that leadership is often more about the meaning and future potential leaders hold for their system, and less about the results they produce. And in this, Adam Neumann shone brilliantly. He took the concept of a single word, we, and infused it with so much meaning, symbolism, and future potential that people simply failed to notice that the results were far from what was promised and that nothing was adding up. It can be argued that our attitude toward the charismatic has come nearly full circle as to be religious once again. We can understand that this worshipful, unquestioning relationship to leadership is culturally ingrained in those of us who have been raised in the Western Judeo-Christian world, which has been defined by millennia of hierarchical, patriarchal, spiritual traditions. If you look outside business, politics, and religions to the lower stakes world of pop culture, you see even this holy royal tendency in our seemingly harmless female-centric cultural icons. Saint Dolly Parton, Queen Bee, not to mention the rabid Taylor Swift fandom, who never question her proclamations and who have the power to cancel anyone or anything that she deems harmful to her rule. Americans love to worship, whether it's a pop music star who makes them feel empowered and understood, a CEO who will lead them to abundance, a religious leader who will teach them how to be righteous and give them a ticket to heaven, or a politician who will help them take their country back. Authority is something that can be wielded only with the consent of the followers, according to Max Weber. And just like in ancient times, when seasons of disaster sent people rushing back to their gods, in modernity, times of social turmoil drive up. The truth is that these manipulative, deceitful, violent, and willing to do whatever it took to make people follow him. While David Berg of the Children of God was over-controlled and abused by his parents and was already a sexual deviant at a young age. It's reported that Elizabeth Holmes, the CEO of Theranos, and an emotionally withdrawn child of a once illustrious family being driven by a jealous mother who wanted her daughter to make a name for herself, declared to her father, a vice president at Enron, at the age of 9, that all she really wanted out of life was to discover something new, something that mankind didn't know was possible to do. Adam Neumann's parents split early, causing him to live in 22 places before the age of 13, finally settling to experience communal life on a kibbutz as a teen. In retrospect, it is perhaps unsurprising that a kid whose early life was so fractured grew up to found a company that wanted to change the world with the power of community. Cult expert Dr. Stephen Hassan recently told me that he thinks all cult leaders grew up in cults. That is to say, situations of complete coercive control and culty dynamics. And while we'll probably never be able to confirm that for sure, it is an intriguing concept. I'm not saying, of course, that any of these things meant that the child in question was predetermined to grow up to be a cult leader. Plenty of children have divorced parents, are ambitious from a young age, or move around a lot. But cult leaders often seem to have been people with significant experiences that force them to develop skills of manipulation in childhood, turning them into somewhat of an ingenue of charisma, and with the desire to recreate those manipulative patterns. It's not always a bad thing if they don't make bad choices. Jim Jones, for instance, first built a reputation by accomplishing absolutely magnificent things. This is a quote. If Jim Jones had been hit by a car and killed somewhere toward the end of the 1950s, he'd be remembered for manipulation. And as a result, he's remembered today as a terrible person. Frankly, he earned that. It is a pattern we see often. Charismatic leaders who use their unique talents to build something that most people would agree is good. But at some point in their accumulation of power, a kind of switch gets flipped, and they begin to weaponize the control they hold over their followers. In Jim Jones's case, this was certainly exacerbated by years of amphetamine and barbiturate abuse. But more than anything, he had become intoxicated by his own power. Just like nobody ever knowingly joins a cult, I would argue that few people set out to actually start one. The problem is that these leaders inevitably start drinking. Being deified and worshipped by their followers gives them increasing proof that they are God, and they start to believe it. Just here in live action that I no longer agree with is that I do think people set out to start cults, and I think it's significant that the leader doesn't drink their own Kool-Aid. Jim Jones died from a bullet to the head. They do often get caught in their own traps, and they do often start to believe in their own deification. These are things I'm going to fix before the book comes out. This desire to acquire followers often becomes apparent in the early adulthood of the charismatic leader on the road to deification, punctuated with a series of attempts and failures to build themselves something, anything, with a following. David Berg was nothing but a failed Pentecostal preacher and wildly successful alcoholic, according to Lauren Huff, a fellow survivor of the Children of God and author of Leaving Isn't the Hardest Thing, before finding his calling by saving lost souls searching for meaning among the hippies gathering in California. Adam Newman started and failed companies before finding his initial success with Green Desk and then exploding onto the entrepreneur scene with WeWork. Elizabeth Holmes had mediocre grades before she got into Stanford through a back door, but ultimately washed out anyway. She only got investment for Theranos because of strings her father could pull and an over-reliance on her charisma and her famous ancestors. Keith Raniere was involved in starting a myriad of companies before finding success with NXIVM. These stories all ring with a familiar note. These individuals needed to build something. What it wasn't important, as long as it came with followers, hundreds or thousands or millions of them. Once they've built something and have a following, these charismatic leaders begin to set their unique talents to code switching in order to become something to one segment of their following and something else to another, which Jim Jones was known to be an expert at. This is an important tool in the arsenal of the aspiring cult leader, as it allows them to speak in several tongues at once, appealing to different but overlapping audiences. It also has the benefit of keeping their followers off balance, never knowing what will happen next. We can see this easily in the rantings of cult leaders who usually show a fondness for having themselves recorded so no pearls of wisdom might slip away. But we can also see it in the famously mercurial temperament of Steve Jobs, or in Donald Trump's nasty habit of nicknaming political opponents and allies alike, or even in a Bikram hot yoga teacher training where students are yelled at, insulted, and forced to keep going to the point of fainting or vomiting, which then makes the little nuggets of approval feel like a sacred blessing. Amanda Montell tells us that cult leaders are often in the habit of using nicknames and loaded language to inspire dread. This sort of hot and cold behavior is often accompanied by threats of, if you don't like it, you're free to leave anytime, a loaded phrase that is intended to actually remind you of the exit costs you incur by disagreeing on any point with the guy at the top. More on exit costs in chapter 9. Aspiring cult leaders often become quite politically or socially active, which helps to attract passionate and intelligent followers who are willing to work hard for change and are seeking a transcendent mission. More on this in chapter 3. For example, save the world before the end of days, David Berg. Unlock your ultimate potential, Keith Raniere. Transform medical science, Elizabeth Holmes. Become the first nation to ever win a counterinsurgency fight, General David Petraeus. Or elevate the world's consciousness, Adam Newman and the countless New Agers and alt health influencers. They can then weaponize this grandiose mission to transform the worldviews of their followers, bringing them under a shared sacred assumption. More on this in chapter 2. All of these chapters are actually pushed down because the skinny white woman got its own chapter. As we've touched on previously in this chapter, did something wrong there. Bringing them under a shared sacred assumption. More on this in chapter 2. Except every chapter is pushed down one because the skinny white woman is getting her own chapter, which is usually centered around the absolute superiority of the leader or the group. As we've touched on previously in this chapter, mythology is extremely important to authoritarian or charismatic forms of leadership, where the leader derives much of their power from the mythology that surrounds them, justifying their authority in the first place. In cults, this mythology, a focus on the founder's image and story, often accompanied by everybody celebrating the leader's birthday, and the story of the group's origins, all contribute to the process of deification. Often, past failings of the leader are included in this story. David Berg struggled until God called him to be a prophet. Adam Newman had his serial startups, and Keith Raniere told fantastical stories about what conspired to keep success from his grasp prior to NXIVM. The cult leader knows he must address his failures, so he writes it into his mythology. He just hadn't found the right thing, or God hadn't yet found him ready. And then, after a sufficient number of trials and tribulations, he was chosen and saved. Cult leaders are often the cult's original salvation story, their examples serving as a promise to their followers. Christian cult leaders will often borrow from the mythology of King David, one of God's favorite kings and unarguably a terrible, horrible person, to imply that their past failures and mistakes are a sign of God singling them out rather than evidence against them. In 2016, we saw this same King David analogy being applied to Donald Trump, as the party of family values famously ignored those values to rally around a thrice divorced man who'd paid off a porn star, likely paid for more than one abortion, and talked about grabbing women by the pussy. But King David was flawed, they told themselves, as they marched to the polling booths to vote for Trump anyway. It was a convenient, thought-stopping cliche and proof of how the mythology of leadership can be warped to justify just about anything given the right circumstances. With the deification well on its way, the cult leader turns their attention to blurring the lines between themselves and any God figure they may have initially claimed to be speaking for. In the Children of God, we saw this when David Berg claimed that his revelations were of equal importance as the words in the Bible. While David Koresh told his followers he was the Messiah, come anew. Sarah Edmondson, one of the whistleblowers of NXIVM, tells us in her book Scarred that Keith Raniere's teachings were making us disciples. He wanted us to worship him. He bragged to his followers that he'd even had people killed for his beliefs. Meanwhile, Donald Trump essentially declared his godlike status to Americans when he bragged that he could shoot a man on Fifth Avenue and his followers would still vote for him. The New York Times, in an article titled "The Cult of We," referred to Adam Newman as a startup demagogue who aspired to be a demigod, but got hamstrung by his ego and greed. Often this goes hand in hand with the leader claiming some kind of actual godlike powers, like Jim Jones staging miracle healings, various New Age channelers claiming they can talk to universal spirit or access the cosmic library of the Akashic records, or Elizabeth Holmes perpetuating tales of medical miracles from her cunningly fake technology. The final step for these leaders in achieving their demigod status is usually a ruthless culling of their formerly dedicated followers and the organization's leaders. Jim Jones surrounded himself with only yes men and women, to the point that he was totally removed from criticism and constantly told how brilliant and wonderful he was. Keith Raniere was always moving people around in NXIVM organization and constantly threatening to demote people down his strike path if they questioned him. David Berg was so dedicated to constantly replacing leaders to keep them off balance that his targets included his own wife and 4 children and many of the people who'd started the organization with him. Elizabeth Holmes testified that she had owned 51% of Theranos and was able to remove or fire anyone she wished. And in reality, employees who questioned Theranos technology, its quality control, or its ethics were fired. Rebecca Newman, Adam's wife and Gwyneth Paltrow's cousin, famously told Vanity Fair of a time when she fired a mechanic for WeWork's Gulfstream jet within minutes of meeting him because she didn't like his energy. This wasn't a one-time thing. When her husband needed to thin out the ranks, Rebecca would allegedly walk through WeWork offices looking for anyone giving off bad energy. And of course, everyone has heard way too much about Donald Trump's penchant for firing people. From here, with their authority now nearly complete and with nobody left who might dare to question them, these men's, and occasionally women's, paths to greatness often predictably include things like inciting their followers and demanding increasing amounts of their labor, isolating their followers. From here, with their authority now nearly complete, formal education, while discouraging followers from going to anyone but the leader themselves for advice, and a failure to delineate true experts will do. Constantly aggrandizing themselves, they are often subtly putting themselves in or bans on advice, sexual advice, or other forms of life coach advice they are not qualified to give. The goal is to make their people feel like they have all the answers, while the rest of the world appears not just foolish, but inferior. This controlling behavior may sound extreme, but look no further than your average Christian evangelical community and see how much the power the pastor has over the everyday choices of his congregants. And the reality is, devotion to a guru or messiah figure without the ability to critically question is not just foolish, but incredibly dangerous. Thomas Robbins, writing for the Encyclopedia of Religion and Society, tells us that in conjunction with the deification of idiosyncrasy, Lifton, 1979, or tendency for believers to rationalize the whimsical behavior of their revered leaders. The lack of institutional restraints can also facilitate other forms of deviant or extreme behavior, including violence. The charismatic leader generally has few to no checks and balances to counterweight their charisma. Scholars like Roy Wallace and Steve Bruce, who wrote about the volatility that's not how you say that word. Sorry, unpicking knitting takes more attention than the charismatic leader generally has few to no checks and balances to counterweight their charisma. Scholars like Roy Wallace and Steve Bruce, who wrote about the volatility of charismatic authority, saw charismatic leadership as the enabling context for the sexual deviance and or violence that appeared in movements such as the People's Temple, Synanon, and the Children of God, now the family. The dynamics of a charismatic leadership can thus provide opportunities for charismatic leaders to indulge the darker forces of their subconscious. Charisma is so powerful that it can be impervious to rationality. In a review of Dr. Khurana's book, Searching for Corporate, this profoundly vulnerable thing, as history has repeatedly proved, and that allegiance to charismatic leaders is, in fact, antithetical to an open society. The atavistic corporate quest for charismatic CEOs, with its deference to the personality and vision of a particular individual, comes bundled with risks of abuse, misconduct, and incompetence. The results are now spread before us, and their name is not Legion, but Enron. As enamored by hero and superhero narratives as we are, it is far too easy for individuals to be deified in our society. From the online yoga teacher who claims a certain pose can heal your trauma, to the brilliant but erratic CEO of the startup you work for, to that Tony Robbins seminar sociologist who once fell for her own political guru turned cult leader, who in an interview warned us there are no gurus. The next chapter is called And His Skinny White Woman, a Hitler and a Churchill and his skinny white woman. And it starts off with, the guru often isn't doing it alone. Because I did epic transitions in this book. Yes, I did. Whew. It was a lot of reading. It's a good thing when I put you guys on the other side of the screen that I'm recording, because then I don't get as distracted with all of the comments. Thanks. Now we can see why this book is taking so long, I hope, because that was just half of one chapter. And my agent made me cut the charismatic leader and his skinny white woman into 2 chapters because he was like, otherwise it's going to seem like this is an 1,000-page book, not just an incredibly long chapter, because you have to like do all the leadership stuff before you can actually start breaking down the cult. So yeah, all right. Now I have to go call people about all these podcasts that I'm launching soon. So stay tuned. Think about becoming a subscriber of Patreon or TikTok.